So we are very grateful to be here in the Log Chapel today talking with Father John Jenkins, the president of the University of Notre Dame, about the active and contemplative lives in Aristotle and Aquinas and here at Notre Dame. And Father John knows a thing or two about both the active and the contemplative lives. He's a scholar on St. Thomas Aquinas. He even wrote a book, which I picked up from the library, on the saint. So he's thought a lot about the contemplative life, and it certainly takes a healthy dose of contemplation and a serious act of will to know as much about Aquinas' philosophy as you do. But he's also got a foot firmly grounded in the active life. He runs a university that has an enrollment of 12,000 students and a $1.5 billion operating budget. So you have to know something about the active life to run an organization this big. I am so excited that we get to talk about this with you.
I am delighted to be with you and to be with your students. This is a great class. Your students are fortunate to be in it, and I'm grateful to have this opportunity.
So I want to kick off, Father John, because you're an expert on this. I feel like the contemplative life gets a bad rap at modern universities. When we spend so much time focusing on admitting students who are great leaders and who are really active in their communities. Once students get to Notre Dame, we're talking about all the different ways that we're hoping they'll go on to serve in the world. Do you think there's any space for the contemplative life at universities anymore? Do you think we're doing a good enough job at fostering this part of life?
It's a great question, and I think universities tend to reflect the society in which they exist, and we live in a very active society that rewards achievement activity. But I hope we provide a space where people can be introduced into a reflective, contemplative life. And I think your students are very fortunate to take your class, and I hope they take this opportunity. There are opportunities for prayer and meditation. So I hope what you say is true, but I hope we can swim against the stream a little bit by providing opportunities for students.
A lot of people come to this question of, should I live a contemplative life, wondering, like, I don't even know what the question is. One of the great things about Aristotle and Aquinas, but also one of the most confusing things, is they try to really dig deep and understand what it would be like to live this kind of life. And I know for Aquinas, starting to understand his thought requires digging into the text of the Summa, which can be a kind of complicated book. I mean, it's not written like many of the other philosophy texts that we've encountered so far in this class. So what do you think somebody needs to know if they want to dig into Aquinas and start thinking about his arguments about the contemplative life? What do they need to know about how this was written and what exactly he's trying to do before they can start to understand what's going on?
Aquinas, it's important to remember, wrote really at the birth of universities as an institution in the world, really, not only in the Western world. And they had a practice at Aquinas' University of Prayer. It's called a disputed question. On an important day, say a feast day, they'd call off lectures, wouldn't have classes, and a professor would sort of be the center of attention, and there'd be a question that was open for dispute. It was always a question that could be answered affirmative or negatively. The professor would say, okay, I'm going to answer this affirmatively. And it would start out by sort of graduate students objections to an affirmative answer, and there'd be several of those. The professor would then respond to those objections, or would state his position, argue for it, and respond to each of the objections. So that was a sort of practice in the medieval university. And what Aquinas did, now those questions in the Summa Theologiae weren't actually disputed in this public forum, but he adopted that. For this reason, he thought that the pursuit of truth was dialogical. We have to be in dialogue with our contemporaries, with other people, and very importantly, we have to be in dialogue with the great thinkers of the past. Aristotle, Aquinas, the scriptures, Holy Scriptures, all those have to come into our thinking to resolve the questions ahead of us. And I think that's so important for your students as they read Aquinas to think, well, just as it was for Aquinas, so for them. They have to be in dialogue, if they're to seek the truth, with their classmates, with their professor, as they grapple with these questions, and with the great thinkers of the past, as they read Aristotle, as they read Aquinas. So in a way, when they read those questions, they should be thinking, okay, we have to be, as Aquinas was in dialogue, so we, in our pursuit of the truth. And Aquinas is inviting us to enter the conversation in a way.
keeping on this theme, like, it'll come as no surprise to any of my students that I love Aristotle, and he's really like the mascot for our class, especially because he has this view that we pursue philosophy socially by having good philosophical friends, by having these kinds of conversations. One of the things that's really confusing about Aristotle on this topic of the contemplative life is he writes the Nicomachean Ethics, and the first 9 chapters of it are all about serving your community, about finding these philosophical friends, about discovering virtue in yourself through practice and through living. And then you get to the book 10 part where he starts talking about the contemplative life, and he's like, you know what? The best kind of life would be one that is completely self-sufficient, where you're just contemplating the true and the good. And that's the kind of thing wouldn't depend on anyone else to realize, and that's why that would be real happiness. And you get to that and you think like, man, Aristotle, like, I was following you all up in here, I was making friends, I was developing virtue, and then you're telling me that there's actually a better life that doesn't have anything to do with those things? Aquinas has some sympathy, obviously, for the way that Nicomachean Ethics ends. But what do you make of this question of, like, I just don't even understand what the contemplative life is or how it could be good compared with all of the great things that come from the active life?
That's right. And there is this tension in Aristotle, as you point out, because he talks about the active life, and then this contemplative life becomes a possibility, and he's sort of which is better. And there is that tension. For Aquinas, it revealed a deep tension in the human condition, and he understood it that way. I would say, I mean, in some ways, Aquinas saw Aristotle as sort of grasping a truth, but still in a kind of inchoate fashion. And Aquinas thought that the sort of Christian faith and Christian revelation, in a way, completed that, and gave it a fullness and a possibility. So, to meld this, to bring together this tension that's present in Aristotle about active, contemplative, which should we choose?
So, what do you think? I mean, suppose I read Aristotle, read these passages from Aquinas, and I think, all right, I want to give the contemplative life a shot. What do I do? I mean, like, do I find like a tree and sit under it and just try to like think really hard about God, or think really hard about what's true from Aristotle, like stroking my beard? Or is it somehow like incoherent? Are you asking the wrong question if you ask about the contemplative life, what do I need to do to get it? Am I just like slipping back into active life mode? How do we go about starting to practice this kind of life?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's important to note the answer for Aquinas and Aristotle differ one from another. Aristotle, what you do, the first thing you do is you become very wealthy, because you need a household to support you.
I'm working on that.
And that's the first thing. You also need to be, you need to be smart, and you need to know philosophy, which is important, and you need to just devote yourself to this life. Okay, that's Aristotle. But Aquinas sees it differently, and it's very interesting. For Aristotle, the God he contemplates is the object of his contemplation, but it's not clear that God is even aware of Aristotle's existence. So the only relationship between Aristotle and his God is the object of his thought. For Aquinas, God is providential. As the scripture says, every hair on your head is counted. God loves us, and God invites us into a relationship and provides, he has this word grace, which is a gift or the strength or some gift to achieve it. And for Aquinas, and Aristotle suggests this, but for Aquinas, that contemplative life is only fully realized, though it may be partially realized in this life, or we get glimpses of it, certainly. It's only fully realized we'd say in heaven, or in this life where we, as he would say, behold God face to face. So in a way, the completion of the project requires us to go beyond this life.
I want to come back to that in just a second, but first I have one more question about just trying to understand Aquinas on this point. So Aquinas, in the reading that we did today, says the morality only applies to the active life. Not the case that you can ever talk about moral transgressions when you're engaged fully in the contemplative life. And reading that, I wondered, Why is that? Like, it doesn't seem obvious to me that it's not possible to be a moral or immoral thinker, or that especially insofar as like Aquinas and Aristotle both think there's some portion of the will that's involved in contemplation and thinking. So I wondered, I mean, it's kind of mysterious, and I didn't understand why Aquinas went down that way rather than the other way on the question. If you had thoughts on that, or in general, if you agree with, I know you probably agree with Aquinas about everything, but
not everything.
If you agree with Aquinas that, in fact, that like there aren't really moral demands in how we think, just the same way as there are moral demands on how we act.
Well, I think at least that Aquinas has an insight here. That is, he thinks that those moral virtues are dispositive toward the contemplative life, but not, they don't constitute, and let me explain.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, he's thinking of it like a immensely beautiful work of art, or a beautiful scene in nature that once we see it, it sort of overwhelms us with its beauty. We're just so overwhelmed with it, and we can't help but contemplate. It sort of just takes us. But in order to get to that place where you kind of behold the beauty, you have to, for instance, you have to go to the museum rather than go out with your friends to a party, or you have to pay attention to the painting rather than be texting or have your earphones in your head. You have to give yourself to it, and that requires discipline. That requires some moral virtue. And so I think that's Aquinas' point, is that you have to have them in order to put yourself in the place where you can see this beautiful, this good thing. But once you're in that place, it has an overwhelming quality so that you don't need a further act of will to be good, to make the right choice. It's sort of like falling in love. I mean, it's sort of like it just sweeps you off your feet. And that's, I think that's how Aquinas thinks of it.
And so then when we get to the end of our life and into the next life, the active life falls away and we're just completely overcome forever, right? Is that the picture?
That's right. That's right. That it's a life where we can't imagine anything better than that, and it's hard for us to imagine that life. But that's how Aquinas sees it.
Yeah. So I think, just speaking for myself as a philosopher, I'll read a lot about views of the afterlife and the eschaton. I just have a hard time imagining what these guys are talking about, or really imagining what it's going to be like. And I'm not going to lie, for Aquinas, his claim that it's just going to be all contemplation all the time, it's hard for me to understand what that would be like, and also hard for me to like get excited about it. Maybe that makes me a bad philosopher, but I feel like, our lives are so characterized by action that the idea of imagining a state where I'm just overcome by contemplation for eternity is really hard for me. Wonder if you have thoughts on this, or if this is a question that you wrestle with?
I do have some thoughts. There's this wonderful line in St. Paul in the letter to the Corinthians, eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor has it entered into the mind of man to imagine what God has prepared for those who love him. The point there being that whatever the eschaton is, whatever heaven is, it's sort of beyond what we can imagine, beyond our best imagined reality. And so just as, Aquinas, this is very central to Aquinas, is that God transcends our understanding. God is not, as he says in one point, if you think you understand God, you don't understand God. If you understand God insofar as you understand you don't understand. And similarly, the vision of this God transcends our understanding. So yes, it seems dull now. It seems like there could be a lot of things, but we haven't had that vision. It's sort of like, I guess it would be like, maybe this is an analogy that, at a certain point in your life, or for some people, you just can't imagine it would be fun to read philosophy books and get in philosophical discussion.
That's never happened to me.
Well, yes, and it won't happen to your students.
I've heard it happens to some people.
It won't happen to your students because they'll be so taken up by these conversations that, at a certain point in their life, they may not be able to imagine these will be so satisfying. Yeah. But as you grow in life, and certain things take on a joy that you couldn't have imagined at an early life. In a way, you become a different kind of person. Yeah. So you can have different kinds of joys. That's what Aquinas would say.
This kind of reminds me of John Stuart Mill, a bit of John Stuart Mill that we studied a few weeks ago. Mill talks about the difference between higher and lower order pleasures, and one of his ways of trying to save utilitarianism from some of these objections that it's just grossly hedonistic is by pointing out that a lot of the really great happiness that we're capable in our lives requires a significant investment. So maybe if we think of the life of contemplation as also one of these things that we have to invest in order to get the goodness out of it.
I mean, I think that's sort of, Aquinas took that insight from Aristotle. That's the whole point of acquiring the virtues, that you think it's hard work to be disciplined, it's hard work to be, say, courageous or whatever. Yeah. But once you acquire virtues, you find a joy in the very activity, not simply the outcome of the activity, the very activity that before you acquired those virtues, you didn't know you could have. Yeah. And in a way, the job of acquiring the virtues is a way finding that higher enjoyment, higher satisfaction.
We keep coming back to the sports metaphor. When you're first starting to learn how to play tennis, one, you're very confused and you have to pay really close attention to all the directions, and it's not very fun. Yeah. But it's the kind of thing with a lot of practice, once it becomes second nature and you realize you're excellent at it, then that is, it's a different kind of happiness.
Absolutely, and there's so many things in life like that. Playing a musical instrument or whatever, that's really how it is.
So I just have two more questions, make it a little bit more local. So obviously we started off this interview, you've got foot firmly planted in both kinds of lives, and Aristotle and Aquinas are both adamant that these are really different kinds of lives, the life of activity and the life of contemplation. I wonder if you see a tension between those lives or intersection between those lives playing out in your own career, in your own vocation, in any kind of interesting way.
I think about that a lot. I miss the kind of activity of philosophy. I envy your students for being able to spend time at this. Though I enjoy my own life, but there's this, it's sort of the characteristic, it seems to me, characteristic of human life is there's always a certain level of frustration, that the kind of satisfaction we yearn for most deeply is just beyond our grasp. We can be active, we can be contemplative, but we can't be both. But for me in my life, that's just an indication, a sign that the happiness I seek is not in this life. Augustine says so beautifully, our hearts are made to be restless until they rest in God. That rest in God only comes in another life. That's what I believe. And so there's a certain restless character to this life, but there's also great joy. So you take both, and I think part of the secret of life is just embracing whatever lot you've been given and finding joy in that.
One last question for you. So how does knowing so much Aquinas help you run a major organization like Notre Dame?
Well, I think...
Or does it?
Yeah, well, I think I would say this about that. There are all sorts of complex technical questions that are involved in running a complex university like Notre Dame. And I don't have all the answers. I have great people who work with me who do have many of them. But so there's that technical, just steering the ship kind of question. But then there's this question, where is the ship going? What's the point? And what's the purpose? And I think Aquinas, as much as any philosopher, and he's not the only philosopher I've learned from, but as much as any philosopher, helps me to think about that question. Where's the ship going? What's the point in terms of the educational enterprise, the search for truth, in terms of the very community that a university is supposed to be? So it helps me to think about those questions and continue the dialogue that we spoke about earlier.
Well, this has been fantastic. I feel like I've learned a lot more about Aquinas and thinking a lot more about how Aquinas fits into what we're doing here. So thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate it, and I say I envy your students for being in this class.